All right, so we're going to begin today talking about the Texas Senate race that's upcoming. That's between James Talarico and Ken Paxton. It's looking to be very close. Polling shows that they're basically neck and neck. Now, I don't know how much I believe that. I think any Democrat winning in that kind of spot would be an upset. So I think even if if polling says neck and neck, that really means there's probably a 1, 2, 3% edge to the conservative Republican side, in this case, Ken Paxton. But just some background information for anybody in Texas. The election is November 3rd. So that's when, like, the day that you'd go in to vote in person. You need to be registered to vote by Monday, October 5th. So if you're not registered by then you cannot vote in the election because Texas requires you to be registered. It seems to be about a month in advance of the election to be eligible to vote. And early voting is between October 17th and October 30th. So you can go into any of a number of polling stations in that time period and cast your vote early, so you don't have to go potentially stand in a long line on election day, which I would very much recommend. And obviously, it's a Senate race. It's not like a House of Representatives race. It's every county in the state contributes to it. So no matter if you're living in Austin or El Paso or Houston or in the middle of rural nowhere in Texas, your vote will contribute to this race, and this race could come down to the wire. So I would highly recommend anybody who is not currently registered to vote to go get that done as soon as possible so that there is plenty of breathing room come time for the election. Republican Ken Paxton and Democrat James Talarico are neck and neck in the race for U.S. Senate, according to a new poll released Tuesday by the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Paxton led Talarico 43% to 42%, with a 3.5-point margin of error, the survey found, largely aligning with other recent polls, which have reported a competitive race since the general election nominees were solidified last month. The result puts Paxton on a promising trajectory, coming after he tailed Talarico by 8 percentage points in the same pollster's April survey. So this is part of the reason why I think Paxton recently came out and said he's against the IVF ban that some of the GOP is pushing for in Texas right now, is that he's trying to appeal to the more moderate in the middle voters that maybe flip one way or the other. I don't think there's really that many of them, but to the extent that maybe there is a some percentage of them, he's trying to appeal to them. I don't think he would have come out and made that sort of a statement knowing his general political ideology if it wasn't for how close this race is seeming to be and that there is some percentage chance that he could lose. And so he's trying to eke out every little edge that he possibly can. Whether he actually believes that IVF is wrong or not, is a totally different question, right? It's to me pretty clearly a strategic political move to come out and make that kind of a statement right now of all times. And Paxton, the hardline conservative attorney general, bested U.S. Senator John Cornyn in the Republican runoff election. Yeah, right now that Senate seat is held by John Cornyn, but he lost the Republican primary to Ken Paxton, which doesn't happen all that often. Typically, when a Senate seat is lost, a Senate seat changes, rather, it's when the senator retires. Especially in a state like Texas where the politics make it swing one way very often, and that typically the Republicans have a fairly clear edge on the election. I mean, Texas has been getting more and more purple over the years. These election differences, if you look 10 years ago, they were much bigger. And so they're slowly starting to even out. And Texas is maybe in the next 10, 20, 30 years could definitely become a swing state, like a proper one. But we're not quite there yet. And so this is a little bit uncommon to see a sitting senator have their and one that runs for the primary again so that he can retain his Senate seat. And typically people vote for the incumbent to have Ken Paxton overthrow him in their primary. So let's go over just a couple of the main differences between Paxton and Talarico. Obviously, one's a Republican and one's a Democrat. So, there's you can make implications about their ideology based on that, but that's not always 100% clear. So when it comes to Talarico, his three biggest issues, one of them seems to be cost of living, which is grocery costs, healthcare costs, wages and economic fairness. He thinks that government should be used to help people rather than just something that shouldn't be involved in everyday life at all. Like Ken Paxton would probably push for. He's very much like a deregulationist, anti-big government, whatever that means. I don't think that really means much, but another one of Talarico's biggest issues is education. He used to be a school teacher, so he's very much in favor of properly funding public education and is for the most part against voucher type programs or anything similar to that sort of will inevitably take funds away from public schooling and weaken public schooling and prop up things like private schooling or whatever that obviously only tends to favor the wealthy and those that can afford to put their kids in private schools or whatever. He recognizes and appreciates the importance of a properly funded, robust public schooling system. And the other big part of, I'd say, his campaign is like anti-corruption. Paxton has a number of legal controversies going on right now. And so he's spending a lot of effort sort of going after those and going on the attack on that regard. And so I think it's fair to say that like he's in favor of a decent amount of like anti-corruption measures and like cleaning up the government, whatever that means. You know, that's another big thing he's pushing for on his policy platform. Now, Talarico is actually fairly centrist, maybe even arguably a touch right-wing when it comes to border issues. He's in favor of border security and strengthening border enforcement and somewhat restricting immigration. And he's actually fairly centrist, maybe even very, very slightly right-wing on that issue.
So Paxton's number one issue is very clearly immigration enforcement and being just anti-illegal immigration, or just honestly anti-immigration in any regard. He's kind of one of those bad faith actors that sort of likes to pretend that like Democrats are for open borders, and like he even tries to paint Talarico as that, even though Talarico is very clearly like pretty centrist on this regard, and that he's in favor of increased border enforcement, border security. He's just in favor of making a like reasonable human-centered path to citizenship instead of just like shutting down and keeping as many immigrants just in general, illegal or not, out of the country, which is very clearly Ken Paxton's position. He probably wouldn't put it that way. He likes to couch a lot of his rhetoric and positions in securing the border and being anti-illegal immigration. But I think in reality and in practical terms, he's against just like immigration in general and wants to keep as few people coming in as possible.
Definitely Paxton's number two issue is abortion. He's very, very strongly against abortion and protecting Texas's current anti-abortion laws. And even further expanding them, like going after Texas women who go out of state to go get an abortion. He's in favor of putting laws in place that will penalize them or track them or do all those kinds of things. He's a big proponent of the bounty hunter bill that passed a couple of years ago. That's like, if you are caught aiding and abetting an abortion, basically, if you like were to drive a woman from U.S. or from Texas to like New Mexico, for instance, to go get an abortion and drive them back, that you could be fined civilly up to like $10,000 because it's illegal for Texas citizens to be involved in that kind of a thing. He was very much pushing for that. And this is also, I'd probably say, number 4 issue for Talarico. As far as I understand, he's pretty pro-abortion in this regard. Now, most of this is kind of posturing because there really isn't, like, let's say Talarico was elected, and it doesn't really matter if he's pro-abortion access, right? The Texas legislature will almost certainly still stand pretty conservative, pretty Republican, and they're the ones that ultimately decide whether these abortion laws are on the books or not. And so, you know, as much, even if both the senators really, you know, even if somehow Ted Cruz flipped on this or Ted Cruz's seat got taken over by a Democrat, which isn't going to happen as far as I understand, that race is not close. Like I said, it lies in the hands of the legislature. It doesn't really matter too much from when it comes to a senator's talking about abortion. It's mostly posturing. I guess they have the ability to potentially, if they make it to the Senate, vote on some sort of abortion bill, but I don't really see that coming into fruition anytime soon. And so it doesn't really matter that much. Paxton's third biggest issue is probably just sort of like anti-big government, anti-federal government. You know, Washington doesn't know what's best for us. He's in favor of like suing the federal government, fighting federal overreach, and doing all these kinds of things. So these are kind of the 3 main policy issues for each candidate at this point. Now, one of the things that looks very promising for James Talarico, if they keep this up and they manage it properly, is the funding. I think Talarico has fundraised more than any other Democratic senator has in Texas in the last couple of decades. If Ken Paxton has only raised $7.6 million and he's raised $40 million, that's almost a 6 times greater amount of fundraising. Now, obviously, like a Democrat trying to overthrow a Republican seat in Texas is going to require a whole lot more funding. So that isn't really that amazing. Ken Paxton doesn't need nearly as much. These fundraising differences doesn't make as much of a difference as it would in maybe like a swing state. But because Texas is getting closer and closer to a swing state, and because some of this polling shows that it's very close, that this could potentially be a humongous difference maker come November. Now, one of the things that both the candidates seem to be heavily emphasizing is religion. Both of them seem to be really leaning in on Christian values and things like that, but from completely different ends of the spectrum, right? James Talarico seems to be leaning in on the empathy, love thy neighbor, more traditional, like Jesus type religious doctrine, religious messaging, while Ken Paxton seems to be taking the more draconian, the more sort of arguably hate-fueled, anti-trans, more Christian traditionalism, arguably even Christian nationalism, being anti-LGBT. It's fascinating to see how both candidates have a heavily religious element to their campaigns, but that they're coming at it from completely different angles. And obviously, I'm not a religious person, but I think coming at it from the empathy, love thy neighbor, the messaging of Jesus and whatnot is far, far more desirable than the draconian, arguably hate-fueled anti-LGBT, especially anti-trans, anti-immigrant, which is very much against a lot of the teachings of Jesus and whatnot. So it's fascinating to see all of that play out. It's almost like Ken Paxton represents the sort of bastardized American conservative version of Christianity, while James Talarico represents the more empathy, human-centered version of Christianity that seems to be falling somewhat to the wayside, especially within like mainstream Christian religious circles nowadays in the United States. According to the poll, the vast majority of Republican voters, 84%, indicated they had moved on from the bitter GOP primary that would support Paxton, a 21% point shift from the Texas Politics Project April poll. This doesn't surprise me at all. Most American voters seem to have amnesia. They have a very, very short memories and don't seem to hold a grudge for very, very long at all, even though in their personal lives, I bet they would hold grudges for a long time. But especially so on the Republican conservative side, they seem to have a severe case of amnesia and get over things like this surprisingly quickly. Paxton's 43% support is a 9-point improvement from his 34% showing in April, while Talarico remains stagnant at 42% in both surveys. Yeah, I would imagine that like Talarico probably has already gathered as many votes as that he's going to gather. I don't think there's as much hope of Talarico flipping Republicans because most Republicans arguably aren't really getting to the conclusion of who they should vote based on like rational principled decision making, but more from like aesthetics, working from the top down. I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative, I represent these Christian values. I go to a church that tells me to do these sorts of things. So therefore I should vote this sort of way. So in that sense, I think what will be the biggest influence on this election upcoming is how many votes Ken Paxton is able to gather or potentially lose with whatever he says or does over the next 4 or 5 months. And that's why recently I think Ken Paxton came out and pushed back against the like hardcore right-wing extremist GOP elements pushing for anti-IVF measures in Texas. He's trying to like gather as many of these voters as he can and like prevent himself from pushing away as many as possible, because if he did come out in favor of that, there may be some sort of like more moderate conservative leaning Republicans who would never vote for a Democrat because the Democrats have been demonized in their eyes. So they would never flip to Talarico, but they may consider not voting for Paxton because they find him too extreme or unpalatable or corrupt or for whatever reason. So he's going to try as hard as he can to appear a bit more moderate in this time period for the specific election. I think that's where he can make the most ground and where you'll see most of his efforts moving forward. Yeah, and this seems to support that. In the most recent poll, only 5% of Republicans said they would back Talarico, who also had commanding leads among independents and moderates. More than 1/3 of independents said they did not have an opinion about the race so far. So this seems to be the only major election in Texas that's going to be really super noteworthy. It's going to be super close. It seems like the governorship, Greg Abbott, has a commanding 47% to 40% lead over Gina Hinojosa, which seems to be a pretty insurmountable lead. 7, you're not going to make up 7% in 4 or 5 months. I just don't see that happening, short of Greg Abbott coming out and doing something that really just pushes away 7% of those voters. But I don't think that's going to happen. So yeah, and I'm going to be covering this race more and more as the election gets closer because I currently live in Dallas, Texas. This is a pretty important race. It could be the very first time, and there's a legitimate chance. I'd say the odds are still very much, even if the polling says 50-50, in favor of the incumbent Republican Party, because there hasn't been a Democratic senator for Texas since 1993, which was Lloyd Bentsen. That's over 30 years. So this would be a humongous victory for the Democrats. And also, if they manage to flip this seat, then I think this would be a canary in the coal mine for all the other potential races around the country that I haven't followed quite as closely that could potentially flip Senate seats to the Democrats. The Republicans could lose the House of Representatives and the Senate come this midterm election, which would be amazing. My understanding is that Senate seats are much harder to flip and that the House of Representatives was much more likely to be the one that would flip for Democrats. But I think people are, for the most part, not very happy with how Republicans and this Trump administration has been handling things these last 2 years. So it's conceivable that both the Senate and the House of Representatives flip to the Democrats. So we'll see. I'll cover a bit more stories about these candidates in specific. I'll maybe do a piece on Ken Paxton, talking about some of the corruption issues that are around him or some of the main policy issues that he's standing for, statements that he's made. Likewise for Talarico.